This is tough stuff.
Oh, January.
What's a fiduciary?
Fiduciary is in a position of trust, or represent somebody.
No, it doesn't matter. You're sitting here for so long that it doesn't matter. It's
Good, sir. And you?
Good.
Are you going to Tuesday?
Fred. Yeah. Across the street from mine.
Oh, I see you the other day. Listen, I want to thank you very much. I read every word.
okay. How are you? No, absolutely. You're thinking you're working in the industry now, or?
Yeah, in commercial.
Okay. And what are you you're a broker or you're?
Analyst.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought. Okay, it's not a local office thing, because I thought like in Dade they did a lot of multifamily. No, isn't that?
That's a smart way to do it.
Well, our team doesn't.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
but our office doesn't.
okay, all right.
That's a whole.
So you're thinking about joining the program?
Yeah.
It's a cool.
Someday he's throwing all this stuff with this crazy.
He's trying to see the facts. That was the recovery.
We've had a few. I've had a couple of retail brokers. I had an analyst at JLL. I had an analyst at CBRE.
You know, that's changing.
I had
Age 37 to 50, 23, life expectancy goes up, especially for whites. Like it's drug and mental illness.
and they found it helpful.
However,
No, but I was saying the overall context, like because we have all these medical breakthroughs, whatever, like it's like medicine, like we can.
It's right. So
what's happening? People are living longer, but
listen. Somebody said we're going to have this class, and they asked me to design something. So I use a financial institutions and markets. So what I try to do is this. So this is not a real estate specific book. It is a book on financial markets. So we talk about debt and equity.
you're all living your assets.
The alternative.
But you're saying
Right. And so the whole time we're in this class, what we're trying to do is well, you got to read this because it brings a lot of institutional knowledge and personal financial knowledge. Okay, so, but what does that all mean to real estate? And so that's why I have all these side tracks in presentations. I try to bring in the real estate assets. Ultimately, these are the things that people look for in the capital markets. What's the yield? What's the return?
I haven't seen
What's the multiple?
Right.
So.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting how you took the SAT.
Well, that's not original thinking. I've seen that done elsewhere. But yeah,
Like to create multiples of that versus real estate, which is what a cap rate is.
which is what a cap rate is. It's not, no, it's just, okay, look, so how does the market view real estate versus?
Oh, you're talking about when he killed his wife and then himself?
No, this one is.
Because I seen something like that.
Well, you're welcome to stay all the time you want, or go home. You can go to labor, you've already got it.
Yeah, we would do it by finance.
I did have another question.
Bill without
So
interest.
the whole program is geared towards
You need to put at least $400,000 a year to make profit on that property.
I wouldn't necessarily say so. I think the original,
Every year.
I've been teaching in the program.
You need to make
I
$15,000
think I'm the,
a year.
But what was it predominantly happening?
I'm the last man standing. You actually have a couple of guys who just got tired.
So the first day I'm gonna guess
It's
it's gonna be
understandable, it's hiring.
so you probably not make.
But yeah, I think the original vision was more on focusing people to be developers. I would tell you the current focus, because we've changed the program around a little bit, the current focus really is anyone who wants to.
I feel like I'm at Camp Mkts
Had zero interest in being developers, they just wanted to.
This is correct. This is correct.
We've got in this class, we've
No,
got.
this is Carol.
She's
From Atlanta.
Going across the south
and understand.
Yeah.
You're not an architect, and she was always like,
Yeah.
Jane would always say, well, I get frustrated
But
when
you send me
clients
the-
ask me for this,
the-
ask me for that, and I don't
the-
understand
the-
why. They always say there's no money, and I just wanna know. I wanna be able to understand their business, so I can do my business better.
To my best
We
knowledge,
had
that's why
appraisers
actually
before,
insurance
we
started out
had
as
guys
reason
who do
funds.
market
Like,
analysis.
we-
Let's say that guys who do acquisition.
No, I won't put anything, but I
Uh,
really think it's over it. You're not gonna show it to me and I go, okay, listen first, or no, you're not gonna show me something and
I got two guys that are working trouble with that out now. They're all over the place. It's incremental knowledge in the realm of the real estate, commercial real estate arena. So, from
The last email.
business
said to them.
law applied to real
Well,
estate,
it depends on who took out insurance policy.
finance, to
So
investments,
insurance is kind of like gambling too.
Yeah, I guess you can just put.
market analysis.
Yeah.
We just try to,
So
in a way, like
insurance
an
is just to
MBA,
mitigate
high
risk.
general business knowledge.
So instead of you taking on the risk for something that's gonna happen,
And while
insurance
I
company
think
takes
someone
it
comes
on
out of
and
here
pays you.
and enter a, like a,
Spread the risk.
a development PM manager position, a project manager position, they don't necessarily have to, that's not necessarily the end of it.
Oh, the Knight Foundation.
You have no understanding of.
Yeah, of everything, another one of them, yes,
Snakes.
she had no intention of leaving the bank, she just
I
wanted to
don't
be
know
better.
what's going on right now.
And she did really well, and, she's still doing and her homework, there was a guy
Very, very
wanted to be a
caro,
residential broker, that's what he's doing. There's another guy that wanted to do acquisitions, that's what he's doing. There's a guy that started working at a development company, they just wanted to be, better prepared for becoming a PM, and sure enough, it got it going, so.
And if we're reading on,
That is true. Drugs do bring back the scene.
Right, no, the developer, yeah, they don't want to spend money.
Or they find the line that builds something else on
Developers
it.
are buying ecosystem,
That's right.
and,
Okay, we started in
and they like to.
but it's just nice to know each other, so.
I'm not justifying it, because that's been my.
Yeah. Right. And the neat thing about it is sometimes you're missing
Well, so
something.
they're
It's a send me.
evaluating their
If you get lost,
potential to start a,
I'm doing all four. I'm doing capital, the
No,
orders.
no, that's, this is also involved, the entire
Yeah, so I'm Carol, I'm the only
master's
Carol.
program.
And,
That's
yeah,
their
so
thinking
sometimes
is working.
I have other people in the class that said,
That's
do you
what
get something? Or I'm working,
Yeah,
it's
I'm
not
not
working
In
out,
theory, they're all
or I don't
programs
see,
are
I can't get out. Sometimes they get that, you know, in touch
I didn't like
with
it first, honestly.
just having somebody else to call.
That's tiring.
I was on the road to the restaurant.
More than for me, it's very tedious.
Accounting and finance.
The Friday, Saturday, we would do 2 classes.
So you're supposed to
every
say
other week.
Yeah, it's important.
That's the whole, anyway, this real estate
At the end of the
to be
day,
more
you're
competitive with other.
somebody for the value. And of course, we attract people, don't just just that, but that's very fundamental.
And
To be a true, if anything happens to you, you want somebody to be there to have your back. And you can be there for that
the other
person.
thing,
It's
just
like a
to
one-way
get
street. Yeah, from the islands, Jamaica.
and the way it's scheduled right now is sometimes it's I think it's I'll put some of that material into the class I teach it. And then, I think this is
Did you read the email?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do. I read the assignment and I was trying to get started on it, but I've been watching the,
Perfect. So you're helping doing projections and market analysis?
Yeah.
Books together?
So
you like it? You're very well prepared in the sense that you've got enough baseline information to contribute?
Maybe some, it's like, oh yeah, big weekend. I got a little bit of capital markets, a little bit of this, not sure if I'll open up
Cold water in you.
Someone else talked earlier, terrible that way, but it makes sense.
You don't like it? Think it's a scam?
Time-wise, I don't, look, I'm gonna give you an example. I have a little boat, I don't use it that much, but I remember going to the boat show like 7 years before I bought the boat. Because I want to know what I'm buying. And with investments, if I don't understand something, I just stay away. I have a derivatives account. Now we'll talk about derivatives next week a little bit. I have a derivatives account, and I have played, and unfortunately it's exactly that. I played a little bit in on the futures contracts. I've done some options, just equity options, and typically just calls. But a lot of time, and in fact, anything that you can invest in, because I'm very honest.
Right.
I'm not even, I'm just loss averse. I'm not even risk tolerant. I don't want to. And so if I don't, honestly, I'd rather just hold cash than gamble.
You like gambling?
Those are all personality traits. Those are all personality.
When I gamble and I get money, I bet it all.
With that being said,
So you go to Vegas and come back at zero?
no.
I was on the tables the other day, got up a whole bunch, and then I just started making bigger bets. Until I broke back down to zero.
Well, what I do, I know I have a certain amount, whether
That's a
I'm
stop loss.
gambling or whether I'm investing. I have a certain figure that I can afford to lose. And I can walk away with it without saying,
So you're disciplined as far as
I'm
that?
disciplined.
Okay. Because I see some guys in Vegas, they go with a couple $1,000, they lose it, and then they go to the,
But I'm not just talking about Vegas, I'm talking about investing as well.
Okay.
I use that same, yeah.
I got back down to zero.
Get it up 10,000, win 10,000.
Because I was smoking the beer.
Yeah.
You do it instead, and you use other people's money to make your money.
I should have walked.
I
got greedy, I was wrong.
You know how you live through people. I'm taking a little break. Mike's kicker is about to attempt his first college field goal right now.
Oh, okay.
I talk to him every day. He's been in pain for 2 years. And he just made a field goal as the half ended and somebody had blown a whistle. So he's got to kick it twice now.
You should put
He
that on.
plays for Fordham. He plays for my alma mater.
And he made it.
Well, he's about to kick it again.
Did he get iced?
Yeah.
What you said, Florida?
He just made it.
Fordham. Oh, Fordham.
How long did it kick?
39 yards. He made a 40. He actually, I shouldn't say it's not his first. He got called in. They played Penn a few weeks ago, and the guy that was starting at the time was injured, so he went in and kicked a 42-yarder. But like he actually started today for the first time ever. It's been a mess. His dad called me. I had breakfast with his dad Tuesday because he's like, I'm going to yank him out of school. He's not starting. I'm not going to pay all that money for it. So the kid just, now I feel good. I don't have to watch the rest of the afternoon.
Did they ever play football or get an education?
Well, that's what I told. I go, Robert. I mean, and it's like, this kid is like, and I don't want. The day before he went away, he took his dad to an alcoholic rehab center.
Ooh.
He goes to camp, has a horrible camp, doesn't earn the starting spot. He had it in the spring, doesn't earn it. And 2 weeks into the season, his girlfriend dumps him.
Whoa.
And I said, you know what? Your son's getting an education. We had yesterday a soccer game. We have a freshman goalkeeper who's very, very good. But he's a cocky little kid. And, you know, he's been sick and he's been injured, he hasn't been practicing. So he finally got back from his injury the other day, and like, we're getting ready for the first game, and he walks into the goal, and I'm like, what are you doing? So I'm starting. I go, you're not starting. So he hasn't played, so we put him in the game yesterday with about 10 minutes to go, and he totally messed up. I mean, he had 2 goal kicks, he kicked them both out of bounds, so we yanked him in like 5 minutes. The kid, I felt bad, the kid came out crying. He was just, why are you crying? I said, but you know what? He'll never forget.
Right.
He will never forget some of life's lessons.
Who was it that got left behind?
The quarterback from
Yeah.
Houston.
It was-
what's his name?
And they left him
And
behind.
they eventually.
Well, no, he was late.
Yeah, he didn't make the
Well,
flight.
I mean, I think his teammates should have been like, you know,
Listen,
hey, dude.
no, listen. We had the first soccer game. I didn't go with the team because I had football practice. And the head coach got on the bus. The bus is leaving at 3:30. What do you tell the kids? If you're early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late. And if you're late, don't show up. So the bus is leaving at 3:30. What time did the bus really leave? It left at 3:28. 2 starters were not on the bus. So, you know, they come, I'm on the football field, they come like in the teaser. The bus left without us. What little consideration? What do you know what little consideration? Yeah, the coach doesn't care enough about us that he left us behind. And I said, well, guess what? You care so little, how did the other 30 guys make it on time to make the bus? They haven't missed the bus since, so anyway. All right, listen, we're going to go over the textbook material. And so that I can jot it down, are there any questions that you would like me to address during the next hour and change? And you don't have to invent them. If you don't have any, that's okay. I might say, yeah, that's part of the lecture. Yes, Laura.
I don't even know how to
Ask the
pose the
question.
question, but what's different, what's a coupon and does it, between interest rates and a coupon or?
Okay, we'll talk about
It
that.
sounds the same to me.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
Okay.
We'll talk about what market interest rate is and what coupon is. We'll talk about that. Okay, so then I don't have to lecture.
Bob got this.
This is just kind of a general question. On the midterm sample questions that you sent us, one of them, it says identify 5 major legislative initiatives that have been enacted after the 1920 Depression. Obviously, there's probably going to be more than 5.
Yeah.
So we just need to pick, or if that was the question, we
Well,
just need to pick 5.
I think we talked the other day about certain ones, which would be the ones that I would want you to focus on. Now, that has nothing to do with the subject matter this week. So, if you want to ask me a question about the exam, you can do so after this week's material. How's that?
Isn't the
Okay.
exam Monday?
At 6 o'clock in the morning.
Dude, are you one of my soccer players, man? Do you read my emails?
I get a lot of emails.
I get a lot of emails too. Okay, listen.
Are you
Alexander,
gonna go with the prime rate at all?
I'll mention the prime rate today.
All right.
It's a very obscure term today, but I'll mention it.
Okay.
It's not really used. Yes,
I'm
Kathy?
just curious why you always use Standard and Poor's and not the other indices.
Okay, it's a good question. By default, most people in the investment world use the S&P 500 as a de facto market. It's not the broadest of the indices. but it's the one that's most widely used. It's the one that's more widely followed and tracked, and that's why I use it.
Okay.
Okay, so the general theme today, as I said, had to do with debt instruments, interest rates, what's the real interest rate, what are bonds, typical debt instruments, how are bonds priced, what's yield to maturity, what impacts changes in price. I'm not going to get into duration per se or convexity. Duration is the first derivative of bond yields to prices. Convexity is the second derivative. The term structure of interest rates, the yield curve, what are the different shapes that we've seen, what do they mean, what alternatives exist to companies to borrow, what sort of risks are associated with that, talk about bankruptcy and insolvency and all that kind of stuff. We'll talk a little bit about what the features of bonds are. So that's kind of it. Now, all the material, I've grouped the material totally the way I see it. Some of it is not going to flow, some of it will. I'm trying to present this material in the best logical fashion that I can. And I start by asking this question to you, and that is generally speaking, what factors affect interest rates? Generally speaking, what factors do you think affect interest rates?
Perceived risk.
Okay, what kind of risk? It's a lot of risk.
Risk upon repair.
I want to write these out here somewhere so we can make sure that we cover them. So I think, Brian, when people talk about risk with debt, you typically talk about default risk, right?
Right.
So not being repaid. So it could be default or otherwise, okay? Because there's a risk premium that's associated with interest rates, undoubtedly. Are there other factors?
Time period.
So the time frame, although you'll see that in fact may not be the factor, but time, because what does time bring?
Volatility. Uncertainty.
Uncertainty.
Yes.
Uncertainty. So, $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, in theory, because today you can spend it, right? Tomorrow, who knows? Is there anything else that you think impacts need?
Need. One person's need versus the other.
Well, we'll talk about that in a different light. I want to view that as more of sort of the dynamics that are involved in setting rates as opposed to factors that influence them.
Is FICO included in the risk, would you say?
FICO?
Yeah.
You're talking about the Fair Isaacs composite?
Yes.
No, we're not done with that. We don't talk about that here. So I'll fill it in and say, if time brings uncertainty, why does time bring uncertainty? What happens in our real world? There's a friction known as purchasing power parity or the lack thereof. Inflation. $1 today is worth less than $1 tomorrow. And based upon our expectation of what inflation may or may not be, it may impact interest rates. Okay, now this risk premium has several other factors that the books talk about, which we'll mention. There's a bunch of C's down here. We'll talk about them, C's and N's and things like that. So. If I were to ask you, what is interest rate? If all of a sudden, Emmanuel, your name became Merriam-Webster, he's sitting in a class and the instructor asks him what interest rate is, what would he answer?
The premium of the money that's borrowed?
The premium. What's a premium? Alexander, what is it?
Everything else different. was gonna say, it's the cost of either acquiring debt or lending debt, or lending money out.
So you're saying it's the cost.
Or like, it's
So
basically.
it's like the cost of a good or a service, right? In this particular case, it's a good called money. So we're saying that money is a good, right? That somebody's letting somebody else use and there's a cost associated with it. That would be my definition. That would be my definition. It's the cost to use somebody else's money. Now, economists, that's too simple for economists. So they've got a different perspective. And for economists' perspective is that interest rate is the opportunity cost, right, of, or the reward for postponing consumption. Because if I have $1 in my hand, I can have $1 today, or let's do this example. I'm going to give everybody in the class $100. So I'm going to give everybody in the class the option. Do you want $100 today, or do you want $100 in a year? Today. Everybody wants it today. So if there's no reward, this doesn't work, right? Okay, now, if I say to the class, and I need you to be candid and truthful here, okay? Would you rather have $100 today? Who would rather have $105 a year from now? Everybody still wants 100 today. How many people would take 100 today or 110 in a year?
I mean, if we're multiplying it by something.
These aren't bitcoins, these are dollars.
If you're talking about.
Okay, no, listen, hold on. I want to raise my hand.
I'll take 110 because the bank is
Okay.
10 on my 100.
We got 5 people, 5 rational people.
Add a
5
zero to all
mature
these.
rational people. How many people will take 115 in a year? No, well, if you're already at 100, at 110, you can't be at 1.
Then I'll withdraw at 110.
Okay, so we withdraw. Okay, how many 115?
I mean, I'll take
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we got another 5 here. Okay, who needs 125? So we got 3 people that want 25. Okay, now, who would rather have $100 today or 115 a year? Yeah, no. No, but we got like another, okay, so we got like another 5 people,
I
roughly.
don't want the 150,
Okay.
I want the 100.
Okay, all right, look, so we got 1 here.
Yeah, I'm still
Okay.
there too.
Because I can
I
take
just
the
want the
100
100.
I want the
and
100
invest it
now.
the way I
Unless it
want
was like
No,
250 or
no, do you want the, no. Rebecca, I know if you want the 100, it's now. I know it's not in a year. Like, I can already see that. In fact, you probably already spent it. It's like, it's just to pay off your credit card, right?
No, I'll take the 100 now, we can flip the coin.
Okay, now, but the exercise I'm going through here is essentially a description of what we call the loanable funds theory. And ultimately, it says within the context of an economy, there are going to be different individual preferences in regards to what compensation they will settle for, what reward they will settle for in exchange for postponing consumption. In the context of today, it's unreasonable to think that you're going to get 50 in a year in a real financial system today. It's unreasonable that any of these 4 options would probably happen, okay? But I wanted to draw the example to say that, you see, we all have different utilities on how much we require in order to postpone consumption, right? Because some people would say, hey, for $5, I'd rather just have the money now.
But
Right?
if I'm a loan shark,
If it was like
Well-
500, I would wait.
Yeah, but that's not, realistic. Now,
But if you start adding zeros,
now,
that changes.
now,
things.
what happens is we can ask the question this way and say, if I give you $100 today, how much are you going to give me, right? and this guy's gonna say, oh, well, I'm only gonna give you 101. There's no takers. Oh, 105. There's no takers. Okay, I'll give you 110. Boom, all of a sudden, there's 3 people left in the queue here, you know? One guy just, you know, sort of matched, right? And when you take a look at the whole world, the loanable funds theory says that the cost of interest rate is determined in a totally supply and demand environment set by the sources, right? And the needs, and the users. And ultimately it says, and again, this is a very descriptive, simple model. What it basically says is the cost of money is supply and demand driven. You know, wherever the push and pull, right? And if you, I forget these supply and demand things, right? So if we've got, you know, rate, right, as demand, right, as right, rate goes down, demand increases, right? Supply, as rates go up, supply increases, and somewhere at a point there's equilibrium, and over time, interest rates are set. Now, this is all independent of any of these other considerations. This is a very hypothetical perspective. But I can tell you, it's who goes to buy gas? We go buy gas, right? Get to a corner, there's 4 gas stations. Which one do you pull into?
The one with the lowest price?
The one with the lowest price. And if you notice that they almost all have the same exact. The competition. Sorry?
The quickest one.
On my side.
The brand that I
Okay. By the way, Rebecca's point is, I'm not a gas station expert, but the preferred corner for gas station locations is the last right turn on your way home.
Yes, yes.
So, you know, look at neighborhoods, big neighborhoods, you know, look at the traffic flow.
Except on a one-way street.
Well, I'm just saying, as a general rule of thumb, it's convenience. So ultimately, it's price, but it's also convenience. And so what this is saying is over a period of time, there's this push-pull. When I did my master's, I had to do a banking class, and we had there was a banking program that some professors at UF had put together for their graduate students, and we were using it, and it was all sort of, you know, had some algorithm that drove all this, but we were broken up into several different community banks, and every week we would have to make determinations on what we would pay for deposits, what we would charge for car loans, what we would charge for mortgages, what rates, what fees. But our class was this whole ecosystem. And the flow of funds definitely went to, all of a sudden somebody paid more interest rate, boom, deposits went that way. Somebody charged less for car loans, boom, their car loans went up. And the whole class was doing what's called ALCO, the asset liability management, okay? But it very much works that way. Banks are always, you know, targeting. What do we do as consumers? Hey, City National, you can get me this loan at LIBOR plus 200. And then you go to Ocean and go, hey, can you beat it, right? And so, well, maybe it works for them, maybe it doesn't. So the loanable funds theory, it's that simple. We can almost go home, right? Interest rate is determined by market forces, supply and demand, where they meet in equilibrium. Now, historically, just to give you some perspective, there's been a negative connotation associated with interest rates. And so we talked in class the other day about Sharia law and how in the Islamic world, interest can't be charged. So banks actually, and lenders actually work a different way. They share, you know, whatever. But just even, you know, in the Judeo, you know, Christian tradition, interest and usury is spoken to in the Bible. And in this country, there are very strong usury laws that prevent people from charging excessive interest rates. Why? Because who needs to borrow money? Somebody who's in need, right? And so it's very easy to abuse somebody when they're in need, right? So from a societal perspective, in as much as it's accepted that there is or there should be a reward for postponing consumption, there are also some taboos or hesitations in regards how far that can go. Let me is not gonna go over any of this. So, this just talks to the whole equilibrium and what sets the equilibrium. So, I'm gonna show a couple of slides right now. As I'm putting this down, there is a, we've talked about spreads, and in the textbook it mentions it. I think it's in the textbook. Again, my notes come from so many different sources. I don't know how much gets pulled from this book and how much gets pulled from other material, but something called the interest yield curve. And so you see that a lot of times. I'm going to just go ahead and show it to you right now. So I've actually, constructed something here. I've actually got a time view on it. So can you see that or no? So what the term structure of interest rates talks about, the yield curve talks about the relationship between maturity and rate. The relationship between maturity and rate talks about the yield curve, right? And specifically speaking to your time argument, right, it is almost implied in any calculation of interest rates that the longer that money is loaned or borrowed, the higher the cost, because the longer the period, the more the uncertainty. Okay, so that just sort of, very, typically, explains this graphical relationship. Now, I've taught this class, I guess you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. I think I actually taught it a 7th time that I didn't have a chance to update. But so I've got, 6 different interest yield curves, and during this period over the last 5 years, the interest rate curve, the yield curve, has always been upwardly sloping. So slopes upward, and it seems to talk to, a very sort of rational, expectation, right? That the longer the period, the higher the cost or the higher the return, right? And so my particular analysis starts with 30-day. The problem is they're not even periods here, okay? So I start at 30-day and wind up at 30 years, okay? But what the book tells us is that in normal times, we should see about a 300 basis point spread between short-term treasuries and 30-year maturities. And for the bulk of this period, we're basically at nothing, going up to 300 some odd basis points. And so it appears that during the last 5 years, we have had an upwardly sloping interest rate curve which corresponds to historical or expected trends. Right? Makes sense. Now, is it always like that? Or should it always be like that? Or does that explain 100% of the situations? Yes? No? No? Okay, what else could there be? Do you want me to show you? Okay, so, in my lifetime, so I pulled these things out from my lifetime. The yield curve in January of 1980. Short-term interest rates were at 18%. Long-term interest rates were at 12%. How can that be? How can you explain that? Help me out.
That's when they had the oil embargo and interest rates were high, inflation was high in the United States. You know that there were certain market conditions globally that wouldn't be sustainable over time. Things will improve, but interest rates are likely to come down. So the long term, maybe, that would explain why the long term is lower and the short term.
Okay, so I'm going to correct a little bit of what you said.
That's all right.
Because I remember the first oil embargo was in 1973, so it was not in 1980.
Oh yeah.
What did we have in 1980? No, we just had.
Oh, I wasn't there.
Inflation.
The savings and loan crisis, the S&L crisis hadn't really hit yet, but what we had was very runaway rampant inflation. In fact, people talk about stagflation because we had a stagnant economy and runaway inflation. And so inflation was running close to 20%. Short-term interest rates were 18. And to your point, that's right, is the only way that we can explain an inversely, right, an inverse yield curve is that people are expecting better times, right? So people are going to say, hey, a year from now, when I buy a short-term instrument, it's actually going to yield much less than the 18%, or we're going to have, you know, the curve will probably likely move down. People are expecting better times ahead, but things aren't good. And in 1980, Chrysler almost went belly up. The government had to bail it out. You know, we had, you know, I say inflation almost 20%, interest rates, you know, 20%, high unemployment. It was, you know, just a bad economic time. Now, again, within the context of our lifetime, February 2000, we had essentially a flat yield curve, essentially a little over 6%. Now, what was going on there? What was going on in 2000?
So the tech bust.
So we had the NASDAQ bubble, right? The telecoms and all the, you know. So just as a precursor, I'll show you something in a second. I'll show you the timeline. It's kind of interesting, but flat yield curves are generally indicative of looming bad economic times. Looming bad economic times. Okay. So I used the word rational before I was wrong. A flat yield curve is defined by what's called the rational expectations theory. A sloping yield curve is what's called the liquidity preference. Okay, and that the liquidity preference can explain both upwardly and downwardly, right? So, you know, you can expect higher returns as time goes on, right? Or you could expect lower returns as time goes on, based upon your perspective of what the current time is in relation to the future and the risk associated with each one. Now, in addition to that, might there be other scenarios that the book talked about? No. No? Yes. So there was a humped. So in 2001, we had a humped, okay, interest rate curve, and you go, well, how can that be? Like, why? And this is sort of defined by what's called the preferred habitat theory, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Okay, so. So let's just leave it at that. So let's go back. So positively or inversely sloped, liquidity preference. I'd rather be more liquid or less liquid, depending. So I'd rather be more liquid, right? The less liquid I am, the more I'm going to demand, or the other way around, okay? Flat. I'm sorry, yeah, flat, rational, or unbiased expectations theory. The humped, preferred habitat. Now, are any of these theories 100% accurate? The answer is no. Are any of them wrong? Probably not. Do they help us understand moods and perspectives amongst investors at any given point in time? The explanation for this, and we're probably moving more into this type of environment, is that with so many notional contracts out there, especially with derivatives, there are investors that have a specific need for a return at a particular point in time. And so a guy here may want, notice how we get an inverse curve here, and now we get a sloping one, and an inverse, and then a flat one. So we get different large chunks of institutional investors that have appetite for different spots or returns at specific periods within the yield time frame, right, during the timeline. And so what it basically says, in today's environment with banks trying to match funds, insurance companies trying to match funds, you know, people doing swaps, everybody's living somewhere on the curve that's different. Yeah.
So is that just a lot of, you know, debt maturities and hedging strategies?
It's all institutional in nature. It's all institutional in nature. It has to do with hedging your positions and trying to match maturities of assets and liabilities together. Okay? Make sense? We're good with this? I wanted to show you. Let me see if I can find. It's kind of a cool site. This place is pretty cool. Hold on. I figured out how to open these things easy. So hopefully this takes me where I need to go. Hopefully this, why is this so slow?
Working on plugging.
I'm not going to waste any time on this. What this is there's a site that gives you the interest rate curve over like a 20-year period on a day-by-day basis. So you click on it and it animates it, and you can see as bad times come, you see the yield curve flattening.
What's it?
I don't remember the name. You know what? I'll just let it. I'll keep going with the lecture and see if this thing loads. And it's not a place I usually go to, so I'll see if it pops up. Okay. Now, any questions on the term structure or the theory surrounding the term structures or the determination of the yield curve? You guys can answer all the questions on the test about it, right? Okay. Perfect.
What was the preferred habit one again?
The preferred habitat is the humped.
Oh, it's the same thing.
Okay, and what it talks to is at different periods of maturity within the yield curve, there are different appetites based upon different hedging or other matching needs that companies or institutions have. Here it is. It just popped up.
Where did the name come from? Preferred habitat?
I don't know.
Someone's brand.
There's another thing. There's another name too that's kind of. Market segmentation theory probably explains it descriptively better. I just remember preferred habitat, you know. This guy would rather live here, this guy would rather live there. Okay, so let me make this a little bit smaller. Okay, so this is the interest rate curve, 3 months all the way to 30 years, okay? Now, what you could do is animate this thing, right? And you see it going, you know, timeline-wise, right? You see it progressing through 2000, but you eventually get to the point where you see how it all of a sudden starts to flatten, right? Like, you know, like right there, okay? Look right there, then it starts going inverse, you know? Okay, you see that's like, oh, that's 2001, not good. The tech bubble blew up, right? So,
Wow, 2008. Great.
so you guys love movies, don't you? Okay, so this is good times. Everything's going great. 2002, things are going, you know. But look, you got some preferred habitat here. there were people that didn't want to be out as long as other people, you know? And you're going, well, why? Why would some people want to be at 20 and not 30? Or would expect more of a premium at 20 than at 30? There's no explanation for that. Okay, let's go to 2007. You see it starts flattening? 2005, you can already start seeing that.
It's alive. It's like
Okay, you see how it flattened? And we're like in 2007, boom. This thing's a pretty good indicator. The market knows everything.
Can you X that with an X?
Yeah, is that what the problem is? Yeah. Okay, so, yeah, but still. There we go. Thanks. No, closing out, just close it there. Damn. Okay. But it still doesn't give me, that.
You
But,
can see the data on that.
well, but listen, you can see that somewhere like in 6, it's flat. And then the market blows up in 2007, 2008, okay? So you can see the dates down here, 2006. I mean, the yield curve is telling us all that time, shit's gonna hit the fan, man. It's gonna hit the fan. Why didn't people realize? Because there's something known as the greater fool theory, right? Other people are bigger fools. It doesn't work. I know more. I'm better, you know. So anyway, the good news from all that is that in theory today, we've got a healthy looking yield curve. Now, the yield curve may move up, right? So the yield may, so the curve may come up here, okay? But the importance is the slope of the curve, not whether it's here or here. It's a relationship, right? The liquidity preference, right? And the minute that we start saying that the liquidity has no value in that equation, it's kind of saying, oh, there's something in the future that we see unclear. We see unclear. We don't want to put money to work further down the line, even for a premium. Okay? Make sense? What do you call the flat one?
Moving back.
It's called the unbiased or rational expectations. And what it basically talks to is an investor that is indifferent. Okay? We had one in the room that was indifferent to $100 today or $100 tomorrow. Time made no difference to them, you know? Time wasn't important. Okay. This is I'd rather jump to this other slide. I'm gonna leave this up. Just try to focus on me and not on that stupid stuff, please. It's like, you know, I can naturally look at that. Okay, so there are certain implications with movements in interest rates, societal implications that are important. In society, who loans and who borrows? So who loans? Rich people? Rich people? People who work? Think about people. Who works? So it's people who work, rich people, old people, retired people. Who borrows? Young, unemployed, poor people. So, if interest rates go up or down, there are transfers of wealth. So in our society today, if interest rates were to go up, right, who's going to be impacted negatively? The people have no choice but to borrow. The young, the poor, the unemployed. Who benefits? The people that already have money, right? Yeah. Now, it works the other way around, because if interest rates go down, who benefits? The guy that doesn't look for postponing consumption, right? And all the people that have money, that need income, are going to be affected by it negatively. And so, you know, I would say from a political perspective, it is probably always better to keep interest rates lower to the extent that they can, rather than higher. Because the people that are most at risk are the ones that are going to suffer if interest rates go up. They probably proportionally will suffer more than those that have loaned making less on it, okay? But just to understand, when governments make decisions in regards to interest rates, when central banks try to influence rates, when governments try to influence rates through policy, what they're trying to do in one way or another is to either support or delay or get involved in that transfer of wealth. So, we've kind of talked about the effect of time on interest rates, right? We've kind of come up with 3 theories there, right? So, liquidity preference, rational expectations, market segmentation theory. How do we talk to inflation, the impact of inflation? I did this one the other day in a very simple format, but I said that nominal interest rate, so what's nominal? Stated. So you go to a car, you go borrow a car loan, and they tell you the interest rate is 10%, right? What did we say that 10% was composed of? So nominal interest rate is composed of real rate plus and inflation. We haven't gotten to risk, we're inflation plus an inflation factor. So a guy named Fisher. Fisher's law is the one who defines this. Very simply, nominal or stated interest rate in its simple form is real interest rate plus inflation. So, if we're in an environment, right, if we are in an environment where the real interest rate is 6 and inflation is 3%, what should the nominal interest rate be?
3%.
9. Now, if it were 7%, what would it be now, Frederick? Okay, you got it. Okay. Now, the problem is Fisher's law is really not that simple. It's a little bit more complicated. And we need to know this, because the real theory is 1 plus nominal equals okay. 1 plus nominal equals 1 plus real times 1 plus inflation. So 1.07 times 1.03 equals 1 plus n. What is this? 1.21? 1.021? Somebody pull out their calculator. No, don't pull out your phone. There's already a lot of phone use in this class, and you know it's.
I'm just going to use a calculator.
1.1021, right? So, if you remember algebra, n then becomes what?
That minus.
So n equals 10.21%. Okay, so the simple formula would tell me that if the real interest rate is 7 and inflation is 3, that the nominal interest rate should be 10%. But the real Fisher's formula tells me it should be 10.21%. Yeah? Questions? Make sense? No?
Wait, that says 1.10, what was that? Is that an S?
Oh, 2-1.
It's
Just to, listen, hold on, listen. I was talking to Dr. Forgy before. Listen for a second. Listen. Stop writing. Think. 7 times 3 is 21. So it can't be an S. So 1.07 times 1.03 is
I have bad eyesight.
1.1021, right? So all we're solving for is the exact formula. So instead of being 10%, it's 10.21%. Now you can write it down. But try to absorb it first. Then you can write it down. Okay? We good? Do we move on to something else? Yeah, you had a question?
No.
You don't have a question?
No.
Okay, so, talk about something else, listen. And I talk about it here, we talk about inflation indexing, but I want to talk about indexing in general. Okay, because that's something that we need to know in the context of following any index anywhere. So, I went to Whole Foods the other day, and I bought groceries for the week. I understand Whole Foods is a little bit more than like a regular supermarket. Probably it's I'm starting to realize it's a ripoff, but you know, depends what I get, you know. But I walked out of there, it's kind of like I didn't buy anything. I really didn't buy anything. I'd already got the total wine. I mean, there was no beer, there was no wine. This was like bare bones. It was like 120 bucks. You know, I live alone 1 week. I go every Sunday. Man, 1982, I'd go to the bodega down the street on 191st Street in the Bronx, and it would cost me like 16, 17 bucks a week. And I thought, and I used to eat like a whole week on that, you know, and I thought, I mean, has inflation really, you know, been that powerful? You know, as prices, you know, have wages gone up 6 times or whatever? And I'd say the answer is no, because I didn't go back and do the mathematical exercise, but I know intuitively, no. If you go back to 1982, the consumer price index hasn't gone up 600%, okay? But one thing is what we feel in our pocket, and the other thing is what the indices tell us, right? And so a lot of times you hear all these guys on television, oh no, but the core CPI is, and so a lot of the errors that could happen with inflation indexing have to do with the composition of the index. So for example, housing is 33% of the consumer price index. Now, what happened in 2008? The value of homes went way down, right? So the cost of home ownership, in theory, went way down, right? So we were being told there was no inflation. But could we feel inflation when we went to the supermarket? Absolutely. Today, the cost of petroleum, a barrel of petroleum has gone down, what? It's in half. And so we're being told there's no inflation. But when you go to Whole Foods, there's inflation because energy costs are a significant component. So you may be saving in one area, but the weighting may not be, you know, indicative of that. And so anytime you look at indices, you need to take a look at the composition of the basket and the weighting of the basket. But in addition to that, there may be errors, okay? There may be time lags, okay? There may be omissions. People aren't submitting. People are submitting erroneously. And that happens with any other index, okay? So, you know, whether we want to take a look at a stock index. Also to say, well, you asked before, why do I use the S&P and not the Wilshire? Well, it's deemed to be broad enough. I think it encompasses like 90% of the total market cap of publicly traded companies in this country. So it's deemed to be, you know, representative enough. But for example, before 2000, REITs weren't involved there. REITs had a market cap I showed you the other day of $400 billion or something. So they didn't really capture, you know, a significant, you know, component. The S&P is weighted, so based on the market cap of each company. The Dow Jones Industrial 30 is not weighted. It is not a weighted index. So every company has essentially the same weight. And then you've got, you know, errors that could happen over the years. The 30 companies that compose it today aren't the same 30 companies that composed it in 79. And every time they swap one for another, they invent some sort of translation factor to kind of maintain consistency. So indices are great because they give us a frame of reference, but there may be errors in how they're accumulated or how they are interpreted.
Sir,
Yes, ma'am.
when you talk about Whole Foods, you're paying for the experience. What did you do with the cost of living?
I'm paying for the experience.
For the experience, you know, the
I
whole
think
food,
there's
want to get
specialized
organic,
Yeah,
and
they
no, all these stuff.
How does it affect rent?
Sir,
Tell us.
That's the right answer.
you get paid for the experience, you're not paying the price of food.
You know, it brings up property value in residential real estate if you have it within a certain.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
So you're gonna show us that when you?
I have it on my phone. Whole Foods, Fresh Market, there's a whole bunch of different.
Trader
Starbucks.
Yeah.
That actually bring
so
up the
what is-
retail.
so
or
what
sorry,
is-
residential.
What is the chicken and what is the egg? And so does a Whole Foods raise property values, or does Whole Foods go to markets where there is a high level of disposable income?
I think the second one.
Property values already high.
So what's the chicken and what's the egg? Like,
Hey, go to the hood, go to the hood and raise property values there.
They do
They
it,
can do it.
and they
They do start with
I went over to,
That's a flat area.
I went over to grab a little thing at the Einsteins, and there were two students, I guess undergrads, and one of them's like, I mean, looks like a strung out hippie kid, you know? I mean, this guy's like this, okay, he's got like blonde hair, you can barely see the hair, but he's sitting like this, right? It's all underwear, the pants are down to the knees, and he's got sunglasses on indoors, and he's got a hat with marijuana leaves all over it. And his parent is paying good money for him to be here, and he thinks he's studying. So I don't think he was, but
They senator right there. 10 years.
and yeah,
Now, I have a question on the interest rates with the Fed, though.
yes, ma'am.
They said they're keeping it fine, but there were some proposals to lower it below zero in January.
Why don't you hold that question? Why don't you hold that question for about 3 minutes? Let me cover something else, and then we'll get back to that. Okay. This has nothing to do directly with what I just talked about, but I find it in my notes here for some reason. And there's two concepts that are talked about in the book, which I think are important and we need to know. One is called strips. Strips are separate trading of registered interest in principal of securities. Laura asked a question before, she gets confused with coupon and interest rate. We'll cover that in a little bit later, but. Let's just define a couple of basic terms. So face value is what? That's the amount of the loan. So in the context of a bond, in this country, we're going to assume that most bonds have a face value of $1,000. Why? Because that's just tradition. So if you want to have $100,000 of debt, you buy 100 bonds. Okay, so that's just it is. Coupon is the interest rate that it bears.
Same thing.
That the instrument bears.
Oh, the interest.
So when the instrument is issued, the market interest rate is 8%. So that means that on a semi-annual basis, because in this country, bonds tend to pay interest semi-annually, okay? I'm sorry. 8% of 1,000 is $80, so it pays $40 every 6 months.
Quick question. Is there a reason why they don't do it yearly instead of just a preference?
Just tradition. I mean, you know, like in this country, most companies pay dividends quarterly. In Europe, most companies pay dividends annually.
Just as a preference?
It's the way custom grew up, you know, custom. Now, I forget the terms, what they're called. Some bonds trade with, at the moment you trade, the accrued interest is paid to the seller.
Okay.
So that you never lose it. But some are sort of stated at whatever and you lose it, just like a stock would be, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I forget what the term for that is. Now, to your question, Laura, if the market, if the interest rate that the market bears for this instrument, all of a sudden, for whatever the reason, the expectation of inflation goes up, all of a sudden it goes up to 10%, what happens to the value of this bond in the secondary market? It goes down because there's an inverse relationship between yield and bond price. Inverse relationship. For these $80 to now yield 10%, the instrument can only be worth 800. You understand that? And when we talk about duration, that's that relationship that exists, right, between value and yield. First relationship, okay, first derivative here. Okay, now, so a lot of times people talk about bond duration in the context of how long is a portfolio or what's the average maturity of a portfolio, and that's wrong. Duration is the first derivative of bond prices to yield, so it's for every change in interest rate, what is the change in the value of the bond or the portfolio. What happens is the longer the maturity, the more the impact of the interest rate change on the value of the bond. Okay? But to your point, market interest rates go up, the values of the bonds go down. Okay? Because the coupon is fixed at 8% of this value. Okay? So the guy that's buying it, he wants a 10% yield. He's only willing to pay you $800 for it. Somebody had a question. Alex?
Yes, you just answered it.
Okay, makes sense?
It's the fixed part that I didn't get.
Now, further defining some of these terms involved with bonds, we have coupon, right? And we've got that face value, right? So another common theme in this country is that bonds have 10-year maturities. Okay, so a typical bond in this country is going to make 21 payments, right? Year 1, year 10 is going to pay interest, right? 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 36 months. And it's going to make 20 unique interest payments. Right? What's it also going to do at the end of year 10? Pay the principal, right? The face value. Okay, now, strips. Somebody came up with this, going back to financial innovation, somebody came up with the ability or the opportunity to actually separate each one of these streams so that if you just want to buy these $40 payment in 12 months, you can buy it. If you only want to buy principal repayment, you can buy it. And you say, why would we want that? Okay, we'll stick around to the 4th class and we'll explain why. But this is what strips are. Now, people started doing it individually. The Treasury now actually, will sell you the strips.
They're separately traded.
Yeah, just strips. It's a strip.
No, I meant what's the acronym?
Separate trading of registered interest and principal securities. Now, going back to when we're talking about preferred habitat and all that stuff, when we're talking about preferred habitat, this kind of explains that theory. Some people want cash at different times, Listen, I want to fund my kids' university. I'm going to need $20,000 at the beginning of the fall, $20,000 at the beginning of the spring. The next year I'm going to need $22,000 at the beginning of the fall and $22,000 at the beginning of the spring. And you could buy strips, right, in such a way to produce that. And you could buy them at a discount, right? and just let the interest sort of accumulate on it, okay? So they're, now, tips. What are tips? Don't tell me they're little bits of beef. They're that, yes, they're little bits of beef. Then what else are tips? Treasury, inflation, protected, securities. I know that one without reading it. Treasury, inflation, protected, securities. What are tips trying to get to? What are they trying to give us? What are they trying to address? They're trying to provide an investment vehicle that takes the inflation equation out. And so the way tips work is the face value of the security is X, let's say 1,000. Every quarter, it's inflation adjusted. So inflation runs at a, let's say, a quarterly rate of 3%, which would imply an annual rate of 12%. I'm just doing. So what happens is this bond re-indexes to a face value of 1,030. Now, it pays a fixed coupon. So the coupon doesn't change, but the face value of the note changes. So what happens is the first quarter, if this was paying 5%, instead of getting 50, right, you're going to get 50 point whatever, 50.15. Make sense? Well, what it tries to do is neutralize the impact of inflation by increasing the fair value of the note. Okay? And so on down the line. So if 10 years from now we've had cumulative 20% inflation, it's going to pay you $1,200. And along the way, what's it going to do? Pay you a higher, the coupon is fixed, but a higher rate of, a higher effective rate of interest because the face value is changing. Make sense? So that's tips. You guys get tired? I should have had lunch.
There's sandwiches still back there.
There was a sandwich here, but I'm not a sandwich guy. I'm sorry? What did you say, no?
Said you came in from Whole Foods. You know what they call Whole Foods, whole check.
Somebody told me it's like $50 a bag or something. I wish it were only that sometimes. Okay. We've kind of gone over time, inflation, now risk. The single biggest risk that people talk about in debt is what? The risk of default, right? Of not being paid. Okay, and so ultimately, we can say that the nominal interest rate is really the real interest rate plus inflation plus some sort of risk premium. Okay. And ultimately, it talks to creditworthiness of the investment. I'm sorry, of the issuer. And here's where I wanted to present the next slide. Okay, so I constructed this when I first taught this class. This is not indicative today. Interest rates haven't changed that much, but this takes a tremendous amount of time to try to. So what I did here was I held maturity constant and said, assuming a different risk profile, what is the effect on benchmark interest rates? Okay. Now, Tula, you asked a question before. There's there's a certain level of misconception in this country in regards to who sets interest rates. And people always say, well, the Fed, you know, the Fed's going to raise it. What's the discount rate today? It's so important. Why don't we know it? Why don't we know it? I think it's 25 basis points, by the way. It was 75 here. I think it's 25 points, 25 basis points. But what's the discount window? What's the federal discount rate? What is it? What's it representative of?
Isn't the intraday rate banks charge each other?
That's a Fed funds rate.
Okay.
It's a different story.
Yeah.
So the Federal Reserve's discount window is, the Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort to banks. So if a bank doesn't have liquidity, where does it go? It goes to the discount window and borrows money. So the rate that the Fed can set is the rate at which banks borrow money from it. Now, what happens when a bank goes to the Fed to borrow money? It's not good. Why is it not good? There is a connotation in the marketplace that the bank is in trouble, and people are going to run on it. So people never go to the discount window to borrow money. So I'm not saying that the federal discount rate is in any way not relevant, but to some extent it's not really the baseline interest rate that the markets use. I would propose to you that probably the most indicative one of the rates is the Fed funds rate that Ryan was talking about, and that's the rate at which banks loan money to one another. Typically done so with security of things like T-bills and other arrangements, okay, and other risk-free securities as collateral, okay? And how's that set? It's set in the marketplace based on supply and demand. Going back to the loanable funds theory, okay? Now, the problem with an analysis like this in the interest rate environment that we have is there's such little spreads and there's such little numbers that you may not be able to appreciate what this does. But what I've tried to do is I've kind of said, okay, well, I said, well, the discount rate is that. I don't know that it really matters, but that's what it is. T-bills were at 0.03%. Freddie Mac, which was intervened by the Treasury, so essentially it's risk-free, was 0.05, a little bit more risky. And this is all 30-day paper, okay? Fed funds rate for 30-day money, 0.11. Commercial paper, high-grade commercial paper. High-grade commercial paper, AAA rated, 30-day, 0.15. Always a little bit more risk. Same maturity, a little bit more return. Negotiable CDs. So this isn't like CDs that you and I have. These are CDs that are held on large institutional levels. Okay? I'm a company. I'm Apple. I got $105 billion. What do I do with it? You know, I buy like a $20 million CD at this bank. Okay, that's what I do with it. Okay, and that becomes, those CDs become negotiable paper. Okay, 0.18%. Bankers' acceptances, and I don't want to go through the whole trade scenario what a banker's acceptance is, but it's a draft that's been issued and accepted by a correspondent bank, right? So it's a letter of credit that essentially has been accepted by a bank. Again, another highly liquid, right, and high grade instrument, 0.19. So again, but a little bit more risk, okay? LIBOR, what's LIBOR? The London Interbank Offered Rate. And what is LIBOR? What is it indicative of?
Well, it correlates to the US dollar.
It's, okay, so London is probably the largest money center in the world. So in the US, the money, why are you looking at me like that? It has to be New York, right?
I don't know why.
Why?
Historical trading with Lloyd's of London.
There's a couple of reasons for that. And then, I mean, this gets.
So in maritime, and it started Lloyd's of London and maritime, and it evolved into that.
Well, I mean,
center.
Yeah, London was always an important, you know, financial center. Okay, but I can't draw. Okay, but if you draw the world and you look at a US map, right, where's the US always?
Off to the side.
No, like here in the middle somewhere, okay? And then Europe goes that way and Asia's over there. If you look at an Asian map, Japan's like in the middle. No, it's a reality, it's the way it is, because it's like the New Yorker. You've seen the New Yorker view of America, right? Have you seen it? Have you guys seen it?
In New York.
It's kind of like, this is like, okay, kind of like Manhattan, right? You know, Queens and Brooklyn, right? And it's kind of like, okay, Florida, Texas, California. You know, it's kind of like, so everything is your perspective in the world. Now, what is true though is that from a time perspective, London, you can execute transactions in London during business time, which is also the same business time as Tokyo, which is the next most important money center in the world. And you can transact business at the same time that New York is open later in the day. So you catch the beginning of the day, end of the day in Tokyo, beginning of the day in New York, and the day in London. So London happens to be the one central point that can span the globe between the Pacific and the American markets. So that's an important reason why London is an important money center. The other one, it gets a little bit more complex, and I'm probably not really prepared to address it, but after World War II, there was a sort of fragmentation of Europe, and there was a whole Iron Curtain, and there was a lot of pressure on not doing business with the communist states, the Soviet Union, and their allies. But they had a need, because they had American machinery or even American raw materials or whatever, for them to gather dollars. And U.S. banks would not allow deposits from communist entities in the United States. But they transacted, right? Communist entities sold goods, the dollar was the common good, and so these communist entities started accumulating what were referred to as euro dollars, which at the time were dollars that were deposited in European countries. And in particular, what banking system allowed those deposits to happen was the UK system. And so a lot of all this money started landing in London, okay? And so it became a huge money center, because now there was a lot of supply of dollars there, and banks could then also loan a lot of money. Okay, so it's been this whole evolution there, and ultimately, London and LIBOR kind of work similar to the way credit unions work. They offer a higher rate to depositors and a lower cost of funds to borrowers than what you would find here in the United States. Okay, so again, it evolved that way. Why is Cleveland a big city? It's cold there. It's ugly. Why would it be a big city? Because there was a trading port on water, and at the time that it was founded, water was the most important way to navigate things, right, or to deliver goods, right? Why is St. Louis in the middle of nowhere an important point? Because it was a point of trade, east, west, and north and south on the Mississippi River. So there are historical reasons why cities grow up, or become important in a certain place, and there's a series of happenstances that just made London an important center. In addition to it being the capital of what was the largest of the imperial powers at one point in the world, and the center of wealth at one point in the world. So that's it. Municipal bonds. So now municipal bonds are bonds issued by state and local governments and authorities. Little risk, but a little bit more risk, right? And you just keep going down the line all the way to where you get triple C, totally, unsecured, or I'm sorry, low grade, speculative grade, commercial notes, with 30-day maturity on it. And you can just see, if you hold maturity constant, there is definitely a premium that's paid for the risk, the default risk that's associated with it. Make sense? Yeah? I can take the slide down. I think I've got one more that I'll show you before I take that down. To help us assess the risk with debt, there are rating agencies. We'll have a presentation on that in our last class. We know the major ones. We know Standard & Poor's, we know Moody's, we know Fitch, but I think there's 18 authorized agencies that can provide that. Well, I don't know, are they providing credit? I don't know, there's 18 out there, okay? But almost everybody uses these top three. What's important is that what they address ultimately a company's ability to service debt, okay? I know in the accounting class we kind of go through a credit analysis, you know, in the real estate space, but I know that we talk about the importance. I'm not a banker, but you know, first and foremost, lenders going to look for the cash flow that an asset's generating to repay their debt. So when somebody loans you money, they want to know the cash flow is there. From a bank perspective, they want to know what sort of guarantees or enhancements there are, right? And we can talk about enhancements in the fourth class in a different context as it relates to real estate debt. And then ultimately, you know, they talk about the value of the collateral, right? So, pay me cash, somebody else pay me the cash, okay, I'll take over what you gave me and try to dispose of it, right? But sort of in this priority because nobody wants, if you're a bank, you're in a business of taking deposits and making loans, not operating whatever collateral is. So the rating agencies in some way try to address, you know, these issues within the context of a company. And what they talk to is company-specific risk, okay? They are not talking about macroeconomic risk. So when Moody's issues a rating or S&P issues a rating, they're not talking about the risk associated with general economic conditions and trends. They're talking about company-specific risk, okay? They provide different ratings. I'll share this one with you. This is I put this together and I just use the top three because they all have different letters and, you know, but there is definitely a cutoff between what is called investment grade and what is called speculative grade, okay? And typically somewhere in the B's is that cutoff. A's are usually investment grade, okay? And then, you know, B's down, somewhere in the B's down, they're speculative. And this gives you kind of a description, very global description of what these firms define in their class, okay? Now, what are important things to relate to this? I found somewhere I've got a Moody's white paper that was done, and it's an historical study. And what they definitely found was that there is a very high correlation between high credit ratings and low incidence of default. And at the same token, they found a high correlation between very low speculative ratings and a high incidence of default. Okay, so it's not any kind of guarantee, it's not a report card, but there is an analysis that's done, okay, which addresses company-specific factors that would secure or ensure or provide for the return of capital and the interest that corporate debt has. And at least historically, they've gotten it right. Okay? Does that make sense?
It's companies and sovereign states, don't it?
Well, listen, it's a lot of different things. In the real estate space, it included securitizations of debt. So rating agencies rate a lot of different things. Okay.
Wouldn't they have gotten it wrong when credit default swaps and everything? When they packaged everything?
Okay, I thought you were going to make a presentation about how they got it wrong. Isn't that what you're? Oh, you already want to make a presentation? Okay, so
I'll switch.
one of the things that people definitely talk about was the fact that